Welcome to the Second Bite Podcast, where we talk with top entrepreneurs and CEOs about creating valuable companies through creative transactions. Now, let's get started with the show.
Hey, welcome back to the Second Bite Podcast. We have a very interesting episode today. I have a friend and colleague, Joe Zanca from DealGen with me. Joseph, happy that you are joining.
I'm pumped to be here, Todd. Thanks for having me on. I've listened to quite a bit of the episodes and kind of followed this along as you've been building it, and excited to share a little bit about DealGen and how we've grown our relationship. So
yeah, and I think you represent a very interesting side of the Deal network ecosystem. I think is maybe better. If you've been listening to the podcast, a couple of things. Number one, you know about our friends at Fiscal Advocate. They are a sponsor of the show. They help particularly agencies manage their financial data in a way that it becomes data and actionable for intelligence on how to run a business. They're really good. Their connection information is in the show notes for anyone that wants to check them out, that's how they can do that. We're going to get into this. One thing that I think is interesting also for anybody listening, we got a series that we did last year called PE Insights. And we interviewed a bunch of private equity guys around specific questions. That was a great episode. And this is, in my mind, Joe, kind of an extension to that, because I know you guys have a lot of private equity groups, really the top tier private equity groups as clients. Maybe you could just introduce DealGen, what you do, who you serve, and how you do it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Happy to. So DealGen Partners is, my company. I founded it with my partner, Brian Scanlon. We've been around for about 4 years now. And what we do specifically is we help private equity funds and private equity-backed companies, find good acquisition opportunities. We almost act as if we're a scout. But interestingly enough, we sit in a really unique spot within a deal, right? So our goal and our kind of mission as a company is to make sure that our funds and our clients are seeing deals that they otherwise wouldn't have seen if they weren't interacting with us. So what we try to provide them is full market coverage, meaning, we're talking to companies and founders themselves directly. We're launching campaigns that are, going out there and nurturing those opportunities, but we're also making relationships with intermediaries, guys like yourself, Todd, who are always working on new projects, always bringing new things to the market. Guys like, or people who are doing, maybe corporate attorneys, CPAs, RIAs, CIPAs is a space that we've just started to crack. Those are certified exit planners. People who help these companies prepare themselves to sale, not only prepare their business, but what they're going to do post sale and how they're going to manage that money. So we've done a good job over the last 4 years and really kind of leaned into it over the last couple of years. Building on a nice database of those intermediaries that, when we bring on a new client and they're looking for something particular, which most private equity funds are, right? When you talk to them, you first meet them, it sounds like what they're looking for is pretty broad. In reality, they're looking for very specific types of companies and companies that solve specific problems. And it's our job to really understand what those problems are and exactly what they're looking for, and then go out and make that match. That's what we're doing. That's what we spend our time doing is finding deals and making that match.
Yeah, and I think you guys do it better than most. So I want to try to dig into understanding why that is. The first question that I want to talk about on the private equity side, the way things evolve there, maybe you could give us some insight into. Usually they sit around and they create a thesis, is what they like to call it, about, gosh, this would be a good industry or vertical for us to be in. So I want to get into that in a second. First, though, I know private equity has, a lot of them have junior guys that do a bunch of blanket outreach and they're knocking on doors as well. What's the difference between you and that process? And does private equity choose somebody like you to do that rather than have their own guys do that?
No. So, we're meant to be complementary, and I think where we add the most value is, maybe not the Blackstones of the world and, the groups that have 1,000 people, they're doing what we do. But, those, call it anywhere from 5 to, 50 person teams where, there's still, everyone's wearing different hats, right? And so if someone has an analyst who, they could be incredibly good at what they do, I think there's a couple of ways that we stand out. One is that our job is really meant to keep the top of that funnel filled at all times, right? So when a private equity fund finds an opportunity that they like and they start going into diligence on that opportunity, a lot of their resources and time get pulled into making sure those deals close. And that analyst that, is out there kind of knocking on doors and making phone calls is now working on closing deals. And that top of the funnel just dries up, so where
most firms don't have a guy that just does outreach. He's going to do outreach until he finds something, and he's going to follow that all the way through the process.
I think, they don't have teams that do it. They might have one or two individuals that are responsible for it, but how much coverage can one or two people actually do themselves?
Yeah.
And I think that's actually, those groups are who appreciate us the most, because we have a couple clients who, we're our direct point of contact is that business development person. And we're always keeping them busy, so they really actually appreciate having us on their team. And, we're working in collaboration. And I think another interesting thing about DealGen and why we've been successful at this is because everyone on our team is previously an entrepreneur or, is still currently an entrepreneur and a business owner. So, we have a pretty small team, but we're full of business owners who can relate to other business owners. And, so we have an individual on our team who, Brian and myself have both sold businesses and ran, businesses. That's all we've ever really done. We have an individual on our team whose family, owns 5 restaurants, and, he manages those and makes sure those are thriving. And, he's opening up new ones by night, and he works here during the day. So when he's talking to entrepreneurs and people who are also running companies and have spent and put their kind of blood, sweat, and tears into growing a company, we can actually really relate to them. Not that, a person who has some good emotional intelligence and, maybe a recent Harvard Business School graduate can't relate to them somehow. But, I think that where we differentiate is that we've kind of also been that person who's, up in the middle of the night with their head in their hands, trying to figure out how they're going to make payroll. And that goes a long way when you're talking to somebody about selling their company, because you have to be able to understand what went into building it, and how much risk and how much time and how much energy went into actually getting it to where a private equity fund is interested in it. Because, PE funds are really only buying companies that are doing at least $1 million of profit, if not much more. And to get a business from zero to that is not an easy task. And so we understand, how much effort goes into that. And I think that's where we differentiate, I think, as a group.
And so where do you guys, maybe take me through what a beginning, and what's it like when you set strategy? How do you know who we're going to target, who we go after, what's a good fit for the private equity group? And as a follow-up, how do you manage potential conflicts of interest? Do you not take different people in different verticals?
No. So, when we first started our company, a lot of what we did was, we'd do a lot of retained work. So, we'd get a retainer from a private equity fund to go out and find them opportunities. And I think where, that is helpful is really only to keep the lights on for us and for them to have a little bit of skin in the game. I don't think it does much more, from a positivity standpoint, meaning, we should be incentivized to go out and find good deals. As soon as you take money from somebody, you're judged on volume really exclusively. So, just because, like I said, if I spend my time flipping over things that I might think, hey, I just need to show this person something just because they're paying me, that's not really what they want us to do. They want us to go out and find good quality opportunities. So what we've kind of changed our model to these days is, trying to identify, all right, what qualities of a private equity fund, make a good client for us. And I think those qualities are, typically usually people who are funded. They already have somewhat of an established portfolio. So they have companies that they already own that might be also doing acquisitions. And, they have a good reputation for getting deals done and a good reputation for helping that, or exceeding in those deals that they got done. So, having and building trust with a seller and having, that what they've told them, throughout the whole sales process actually coming to fruition, right? And them getting that, second bite of the apple, which, coincidentally is the name of this podcast. So we're always kind of, looking for a few things. Like I said, funded, they have a portfolio, they know what they want, and they act when they see it, right? So a lot of my job is, 99% of the time I'm getting told, no, not a good fit, not a good fit. But we actually don't mind that, because what that tells us is that they're very keen in understanding of what is a good fit. And those quick no's are absolutely the second best answer for us. So what we like to see is when we do send something over that is a fit, there's that kind of immediate action, and they have that, they dive right in and they're like, hey, send us over the NDA, send us over whatever data you have on this company. We really want to see it. And I think the best funds that we work with, that might be one out of every 25, 30 deals that they really kind of dive in on. And that's because, again, they have a really quality understanding of what they're looking for. So we spend a lot of time with them trying to build that understanding ourselves and knowing, okay, our job is pretty simple. This is what they want to buy. This is what they already own. And this is what they've had success with in the past. If we can understand all three of those things about a fund and, apply a little bit of technology and just mental understanding in the middle, then when we see a new deal, we can match that pretty effectively.
So let's give a couple tips to our listeners. First one that comes to mind is I will oftentimes, when we start with a client, they'll say, oh, we've had a bunch of inbound, and so I'll give you a list of those 6 or 8 or 10. And if there's 10, 6 or 7 of them just aren't real.
Right.
It's a guy that wants to do a thing. It's somebody that wants to roll up some stuff. They want him to take a minimal amount of cash, and then risk a bunch and all that kind of nonsense. But it's very hard for an entrepreneur that doesn't know and doesn't have the experience to tell the difference. Is there any insight you can give along those lines?
Yeah, I think that
or maybe questions that the entrepreneur can ask the person that's calling?
For sure. I think that understanding whoever's knocking at your door's track record is important. And I think that, a website or a LinkedIn profile definitely doesn't tell the whole story, but it can tell you enough about who's knocking that, it can give you some insight into, okay, there's a few things that go into actually closing deals that are super important, right? Like, has this person bought a company before? There's a lot of people out there now, and then there's this culture that's being built. And I think it's a good thing more than it is a negative thing. But in the world of business acquisition, where, people are teaching maybe ex-executives or corporate bros that you can go out and buy a family-owned business with zero money down or with very limited money down.
Right.
And I think that if you have a good understanding of your business and the fact that, like, hey, my company is profitable year over year. We've grown year over year. And, we're at a size of, call it $1 million plus of profit or EBITDA, where there is going to be interested buyers in there. Then now you have an understanding of, all right, I'm a competitive company, right? It's just like, having a house in a nice town that, you take care of the lawn and you clean up the outside and you keep everything, what you have, so if you have an understanding of what you have, which is, a nice, profitable, growing, healthy business that's been around for a while and solves a pretty unique problem, then, you shouldn't take that first offer that comes knocking at the door. But then when people do start knocking at the door, there's a reason, because, you've obviously made a name for yourself enough where there's interested buyers. But getting an understanding just by looking maybe at their LinkedIn profile or their company's website of who they are, their track record for success. Are they capitalized, right? Do they have money? And is that like a proven thing? Usually any, somewhat decent private equity fund has, AUM, which is assets under management. And that means that they've bought companies before. They know how to do diligence. They know what pitfalls might come in. They know how to get funding. In today's world, getting anything funded is pretty difficult with interest rates and everything like that. So if someone doesn't have the funding lined up, then they're, kicking your tires and kind of pumping you up and telling you, oh, this is, we're going to make you the best offer. You guys are going to thrive underneath us. Meanwhile, when they hang up the phone with you, they're spending a lot of their time kind of panicking as to, hey, how the hell are we going to finance this thing? They don't have that lined up. So I think some of the questions you can ask is, all right, well, have you bought companies like us before? Have you bought any company before? Have you exited a company before? What did that look like when you did buy that company and you did exit it? What happened with the person that previously owned it? Did they roll equity into it? Did they get a second bite of the apple? Did they, do everything that I ultimately want to do as the seller? I think those are some things that you should look out for.
Cool. All right, time for 1 sec. The sun's coming in the back, and it's
Is that good?
Yeah.
I just turned.
Yeah.
Yeah, I struggle with. I got a fucking curtain, but
no sweat. All right, so now we're back on.
Okay.
All right, so let's just assume that you're the right guy when you call me. You're calling a lot of guys. What turns you off when you find somebody? What is there something that they say, something where you're just like, this guy's going to be difficult, or they're not where they need to be, or this isn't going to be a fit? How would you advise somebody listening to handle a call like yours?
Yeah, no, it's a great question because, it's one of those things where we are talking to a lot of people and understanding. I mean, I think being in a position where selling actually is top of mind. I think that there's a commitment from the sell side that, if they do get the offer that they like, that they're realistically actually going to sell the company. I think that's a struggle that, I feel like you probably run into too, is, you're talking to somebody and they feel like some sort of internal pressure that, now might be the time to sell it. But in reality, in the back of their head, they're not bought in really at all. And so they're going through the motions of, maybe answering some of these questions, but, we try to get a gauge for, all right, is now time? And if they have a realistic expectation, right? I mean, everybody should want to maximize the value of their company in a transaction. But another thing would be, setting realistic expectations, right? Just because, your friend at the country club tech company sold for 25x, doesn't mean that maybe your HVAC company or your digital marketing company is in that same category and is going to also do that. So I don't expect, sellers to have a full-blown education on valuations the first time I talk to them. But, I do understand that, if they are doing a couple million of profit and, they want $100 million to walk away, chances are our buyers are never, aren't going to pay them that.
I don't know if there's any buyer that'll pay them that.
Right.
When do you typically get to that? Certainly not on the first call, or are there signs on the first call that you try to pick up on?
I think there are signs on the first call. I mean, it's not what we open up with. I think that we try to get an understanding of who the person is, how the company came to be, right? And, is this a company that they started 5 years ago? Is this a 50-year-old family-owned business? How did they become in a position of, power? What's their role at the company? What do they do on a day-to-day basis? I think that one thing that, and you'd probably understand this too, Todd, is when you're looking through the eyes of a private equity fund, obviously the CEOs and the owners have a significant impact on the business that they own. But if they're the ones actually like doing all of the work, then replacing them is going to be really hard, right? So if they've built systems that allow the CEO or the president or the owner of the company to really focus on what their value is to the company, and they have a team and managers underneath them or a team underneath them that actually does most of the labor and the work that goes into getting these jobs done, then that's going to be a lot more that's going to be a lot more attractive to a private equity fund who can easily maybe make that purchase and eventually, if they're going to own that company for 5, 10, 15 years, find a replacement for the CEO who's done the right thing and or not done the right thing, but put in all the effort and work to make themselves replaceable. So we try to get an understanding of who the person is, what they've built, how they fit into that. And then, ultimately we talk to them about our clients and what they're looking for and how they might be able to fit into that. And then, if it doesn't come out in the first call, we try to get an understanding of what their expectations are pretty soon thereafter, right? Because that's just a big thing. If I don't want to waste their time having a conversation around an acquisition that I can't even come close to, nor do I want to waste my client's time, bringing them on the phone, having them ask, 30 minutes of the same questions that I already asked, and then ultimately getting to a point where they're like, hey, we want 100x valuation. And then I look like kind of a dope. So,
because I also think it would be helpful, because there's a bunch, you've mentioned HVAC, and there's a few people doing really good roll-ups in that space. Same thing with digital marketing, same thing with plumbing and any vertical you can think of. But if there's a really good company in that space, they probably would be more comfortable with me leaving sooner, as long as my customers stay and so forth, than somebody that is not in that space right now, doesn't have knowledge of that space. But somebody that could be an interesting offer from that standpoint, right?
You mean like like you're the owner of the company and you've built something really good, and
I built something really good, but I'm integral. I'm operative in the business. I manage the business every day. But if you have a private equity group that has already acquired 4 of these businesses, and I say, listen, I want to leave by the end of the year or in 12 months, your guys are probably less intimidated about that than somebody that said, hey, we want to be in the plumbing vertical. Let's go buy a big plumbing shop. Because then if I leave, they're screwed.
Definitely. Yeah, no, I think that, you're spot on with that. And, one thing that we try to understand is, what's your motivation for potentially selling your business, and what does your ideal post-sale situation look like? And I think most of our PE funds, who do majority acquisitions, meaning they buy anywhere from 51% to 90% of a company, 95% of a company. Most of our guys are flexible in how they approach somebody. If someone wants to just sell their company, stick around for 3, 4, 5 months during a transition period and then leave, our guys have no problem trying to solve that problem. Like, what are we going to do after they're gone? But it might reflect, what a valuation looks like today, right? Versus if they're willing to and want to, be a part of something bigger than they are today, and doing it with private equity makes the most sense, then our guys will be like, okay, well, we'd love you to stick around. We're still going to own a majority of the company, but we're going to make you an offer that's incentivizing you to stick around and grow this thing for a little bit longer and become a part of something bigger, have more resources than you have today, maybe take a little bit of responsibility off your day-to-day plate to focus on the bigger picture. And then you'll get a second exit, hopefully, 3, 5 years from now,
right,
that might even be bigger than the first one. So It really kind of comes down to understanding what that person's goal is. Are they, in their mid-60s and they just want to retire and they decided, look, today's my last day of work? Or are they, at a point in their life where they feel like they've grown it as far as they can take it and they want to be a part of something bigger, but also cash in on all the value that they've created today?
I think that's always the question, right? Is my future better, brighter, and more happy as part of something larger versus remaining independent? I find it's hard for guys to really understand that until they sit with this idea and move through the conversation with your client and all those things. It takes a while to get clarity, right? In terms of realizing, geez, maybe I really don't want to sell, maybe I do. But one thing I counsel clients on all the time is you have to be honest with whoever you're dealing with about everything in the business, but also including your motivations. And I think there's this misconception that I don't want to tell Joe the wrong thing because I don't want to lose this fish on the hook, if you will, right? Because everything sounds exciting. I don't want to tell him I want to leave in a year. And then, I don't know that you're ever stuck, but then you're in a position where you're like, geez, when do I tell them the real truth? My long-winded question is, what do you find is the hardest thing to get guys to tell you the truth about early in the process?
I would say financials is sometimes tough to pry out of people's hands for whatever reason.
Just to get it.
I think even just to get them, well, that's another thing, to go back to one of your earlier questions, like, what are we looking for? Like, if they're not willing to, even post NDA, like really share a lot about the company, then, what are we talking about? Like, we can't, a lot of people, sometimes, we do so much outreach, and, a lot of our outreach is leading with the truth, which is, hey, we work with private equity funds and have identified your business as something that they might want to acquire. At the end of the day, they're still a privately owned company. There's only so much that we can find out about that company without getting that information from them. But a lot of the time we'll get a response that says, all right, well, make us an offer. Like, well, I don't really know what you want me to do. I am, it looks like you guys make a lot of money. It looks like you have quite a payroll, so you must do okay. But I can't really make you a solid offer without, understanding those things. So I think, getting some financials out of them. And I think that, your point being the real truth, like what do you want your life to look like after a sale? And that's a question that, I'm sure is really important for you to ask anybody that you want to work with, because you have to be able to weave that into the story. Like, hey, this seller has created this, and they're just a few resources and a bigger team or a sales team away from being able to go from here to there. And that's why they want to be a part of you,
Yeah. So I'm just going to make up an industry. We were talking about HVAC before. So you reach out to me. I have an HVAC company. You've already bought 4 of them.
Yep.
I'm going to be more nervous about sharing my secret sauce or my financials or what have you because of that. Is that true or not true?
I think so. Yeah. I think people, and you brought up before we even talked, before we went live here, the idea that, some people they say they don't have competition, right? Or they do something that's so unique to that anybody else does that, like, no one can compete with them. And in reality, that's probably not the case. And especially
right. There's a sign you don't really either understand your business or understand the marketplace well.
Right.
A friend of mine, as an example, that owns a car wash. And in the car wash business, you literally own essentially a certain radius around your car wash.
Yeah. Yep.
So you don't have any competition. And a new guy, is not necessarily going to come in next year. Joe says to me, my biggest competition is the driveway. The dude washing his car in the drive. I have competition in that whatever that 2-3 mile radius is, every freaking driveway is my competition. And I thought about that, and I'm like, that's a guy that understands his business.
For sure.
Right?
Sure. Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's interesting, but I think that, to your point, for whatever reason, a seller might be more nervous to talk to somebody who already owns something in that space than to talk to somebody who is just trying to get into it. Yep. And I think that's natural. I think that, they're afraid that they're going to, or maybe their competition is going to find out that they're selling and they're going to intrude on their territory or something.
No, I hear that a bunch too, Joe. And I always remind clients, these guys, in your case particularly, these guys are spending money to get this conversation with you. You think they're going to run around town and start telling people, oh my God, I got the ABC company. I talked to them the other day. I think they might sell. They're going to keep it super secret, right? Top secret. So nobody else ever finds out. It's the last thing they want is people to know that you might be on the market.
100%.
Right?
Yeah. Because there's just as many people competing with the private equity fund in trying to buy those HVAC companies.
Yeah.
And there are HVAC companies locally that are going to steal market share. So if they let them,
right. What the hell, right? It used to be much more like I'm not going to release my information, like my employee roster and names and the rest. If I cared enough, I could find them all on LinkedIn. I could find a lot. I could find your senior management right on your website.
100%. Yeah, you put it out there for the world to see.
Right. So let me ask you this: what do so when you find somebody and they're interested, what would you advise them? Like, when do they get involved with their advisors, and who is it? Like, when do they get a lawyer? When should they talk to their financial advisor or their accountant? How does all that play out on your side?
So what we try to do is, we try to stay relatively risk-free, meaning, let's say we're talking to somebody proprietary who hasn't hired someone like yourself yet, and we're just learning about their company. What we try to tell them is, look, it sounds like you built something pretty good. It sounds like you're interested in what selling might look like. It sounds like, we get a feeling for, do they have their ducks in a row, right? If we request financials and we request some more information about the business, is that readily available? Because if it's not, we have to kind of wait till it is, or we have to get that stuff readily available. But if it is, it's like, hey, let's go, we have maybe a handful of potential buyers on our roster that could be interested in an opportunity like this. Why don't we see if we can set up some conversations and get you in front of real buyers who have already bought or are buying companies in this space, and that we know, and who have told us to go out and find guys like you and see where the conversation goes, right? And we try to get them, a decent understanding if they ask of, what a valuation may or may not look like, try to be reasonable about it. But at the same time, we're not going to tie, a price or anything like that, or a structure down right away. The beauty of it is that they have that conversation. If it goes really well, then, they're on to the next step. And that fund is now going to start requesting more information and more data from them. At that point in time, we always try to advise them, hey, you do want someone in your corner here, right? Because the kiss of death in an acquisition, if it does end up going the way that you want it to, which they make an offer and then now they're trying to buy your company, you have to still run that company as effectively, if not more effectively than you ever have before.
For about 90 days, right?
For about 90 days. Yeah, for about 90 days. Because if you start dipping, that's when the valuation starts dipping too, or that's when interest starts dipping from the buy side. So you need someone in your corner who's going to make sure that you can run your business and this acquisition is going to go through, and they're not just going to do a job. This is their full-time job that they've done, hundreds of times before. So they understand what questions are going to come up. They understand, and let's be honest about the world of private equity, right? These guys are professionals. When they see, a potential advantage, they're going to, they're going to make the deal good for them. They're going to try to make the deal good for them. And usually they're going to walk out of any deal with a good deal. But that doesn't mean that you aren't either. You just have to have somebody in your corner who understands what's fair, what's not, and what's reasonable and what's not, and be able to fight for you, during that battle. But I think, if that first or second conversation goes well, that's when, going and hiring, maybe someone like yourself, if you haven't decided, hey, I'm going to market this business more broadly, if you've just gotten approached by us, and, we're usually the ones encouraging that, because it's in our best interest to have a deal closed.
It's interesting, and for people that want to listen, John Morris, who is now at Fiscal Advocate, you should look up the episode on John Morris. John Morris got an outreach from a group, liked him, made him a fair offer. This is what I'm going to do. I said, geez, man, don't you think you could have gotten more? Yeah, he's like, I don't know. Maybe I could have, maybe I couldn't have. I liked him. It was important to me that I liked the group. It was a good spot. And I will also say there's an interesting dynamic, a very interesting dynamic, when you're focused on a second bite transaction, as opposed to I'm selling the whole thing and I'm leaving.
Right.
Because we're going to be partners now.
Yeah.
And I believe at some point, Joe, you're going to find out what I did for you or to you.
Yeah.
And you're going to be really happy or really pissed when that happens. And for good private equity, like the groups you represent, there's so much more value to be created from a good relationship and the future value than trying to squeeze a few $100,000 or so from an entrepreneur that's worked his freaking whole life to build a solid business. The good guys don't view the world that way,
No, they don't. And we've seen both sides of that coin. We've seen people who are in the private equity space who approach a conversation with somebody, and even after on the first call, they're accusatory and they're, why'd you do it like this? Why the hell did you build it like this? And why aren't your margins better? And like, it's like you're talking to somebody who spends God knows how much time and has spent God knows how much time and worries every single day about, their employees and their company and their brand and stuff like that. And you're going to get on the phone with them and talk to them that way, or like you're setting a really bad tone. So we've learned through action and learned through going through those steps, like, who do we want to get on the phone with people and who do we not want to get on the phone with people?
Sure.
And that's important for us. Like when we send a deal to somebody, one of our funds, it's a reflection on us. Like, hey, one of the biggest things we say all the time is, I don't know if they're going to buy this company, but they're not going to make us look bad. Meaning they're going to come prepared with the right questions. They're going to be respectful of the person that built that business. And then ultimately they're going to try to do a deal that works for everybody. They're going to pay fair market value and they're going to incentivize that person to become a part of what they're trying to build,
Right.
If they like them.
And one of the things I share with people all the time, and you're kind of saying this as well. Let's pick up on the margin comment you made. You get that margin, like why your margin's low. You get it from one person, and I don't know if they're selling me, squeezing me, or if my margins are low, right? But if I talk to 4 or 5 and everybody said, geez, man, your margins are low, then that's an issue.
Right.
Now the question becomes, what do I do about the issue? Because I can join with these guys probably at a lower value than if my margins were better. Because my margins were better, my EBITDA would be better. But that's not an easy fix.
No, it's not.
Right? That could be a multi-year project to get margins back. And by the way, if your margins go from 10% in year 3 to 15% in year 4, private equity is going to ask, well, is this a 10% company or 15% company? Well, you just getting skinny for the wedding. Let's see one more year. So it's not right. It's not a simple process like, oh, we'll just fix margin. And so then the question becomes, what's the best way for me to fix margin? And it may be the best is to do a transaction near term and then load up on the second bite and, make up the rest then. And then I can focus on the stuff I like best because there's a reason my margins are where they are, right? Mm-hmm. And you got to be honest about that and then decide if you're the right guy to fix it or you should quote unquote outsource, the fix of that.
Yep. It easily could be that easily could be the best thing to do. I think it all does go back to, what does your ideal post-transaction life look like? And if it's golfing more, then fixing the margins and golfing more don't align. You're going to be golfing way less, trying to fix it.
Very well. As we wrap up, Joe, give me 2 or 3 kind of words of wisdom to our listeners on if you get outreach from somebody like you, what's a proper way to manage that call and that interaction?
Yeah, I think don't be afraid that someone's interested in buying your company. I think that there's sometimes this fear comes over these sellers of like, oh, like, I don't know what to do. I don't know what they're going to say. I don't know if they're going to ask me something about, that I don't want to share. Like they feel like they have all these secrets and they can't, tell anybody about them. And I would say just don't be afraid of it at all. Right. And
if they don't want to share, Joe, what should they say?
Well, if they don't want to share, then I still think personally, taking the call is better than not taking the call. What risks do you have with taking a call? Right. So set up a conversation and be as inquisitive as you think they're going to be to you, right? So ask them those questions that we talked about at the beginning. Ask them, hey, who are you guys? Have you had success in my industry before? Have you bought companies before? Do you have a fund? Like what's your goal if you were to buy me? Let's say I was a fit. What's your goal in buying me? Are you trying to have another exit 5 or 7? Just get an understanding for who they are. And if you like them, it doesn't mean you have to sell your business to them right this second. It's like, no, I made a good impression. I got a good sense of who they are. I still want to work for 2 more years. I'm telling you, if you call that fund and they're a good fund 2 years from now, they're still going to have money and they're still going to want to buy your business.
And they're going to have all the notes from your first call.
Yeah, they're going to keep all those notes.
Yeah.
So
the other thing too,
I think the call is something that I take the call.
And as a general rule, I always tell folks that in interactions like this, nobody asks a question they're not prepared to answer themselves about their business. So it's, to your point, it's not an interview. It's a dialogue, right? It's a two-way conversation. And it's interesting. We just posted this morning a podcast with Chris here, which you can look up. We went through a process and did not get a transaction done. He said it was the best business experience of my life. He has changed 2 or 3 key things, and because of all the feedback he got.
Oh yeah.
Right. And you can't get it from somebody else. The market, I think, is most direct and honest and straightforward because there's money at stake, right?
100%.
And he couldn't quite get the value he wanted. And he determined, I'm going to fix these couple things. I realize it might take me a couple years. I'm going to fix these couple things, and then I'll come back and, hopefully to a good market and a better result.
Yeah. I mean, we had a guy who he came to us. He wanted to transact proprietary deal. It was actually a perfect match for one of our funds. They wanted to buy his capabilities. The biggest issue with the company was that he had customer concentration through the roof. So he was getting 75, 80% of his revenue was coming from one customer that was super sticky for a long time. I kid you not, this is not even like a made up story at all. He gets an offer from them, negotiates it a little bit, gets that second offer, literally is going to have coffee and sit down and review it and potentially sign it. And now, granted, after a signed offer, you're still a ways away from closing.
Right.
He just signed the offer, gets a call from his biggest client saying, "Hey, we're cutting budgets, and you guys are part of that." Overnight, half his revenue is gone.
Wow.
So they're still gonna, they're still doing some work with him, but he just went from 10 million and 2 of EBITDA to 4 and 800K.
And every private equity group out there has lived that experience either before they closed or after they closed. It's the reason why you get knocked on value for customer concentration. It's greater risk to the business.
100%. And as sticky as they were, and as this client was a household name. I mean, everybody knows who they are. But what ended up happening ultimately is that didn't transact that day. Decided to go back and fix everything that just happened, right? I mean, there's a lot of things to fix when that happens. But, his business, fast forward a year and a half later, is much less concentrated, offers a few different, more unique services, maybe isn't as big as they once were with all that concentration, but is probably in a spot, where another year or so from now, they're going to command a much better multiple. So it's one of those things where even like the worst case scenario in your mind, like that could happen to your company, you can still take it, and hopefully learn from it and put yourself and position your business. I mean, sometimes it takes something like that for someone to make those changes. And that's a really unfortunate way to have to do it. But, just kind of pivoting off your story, like it's not the worst thing at all to have these conversations, get to a point where you're going to transact, understand why you're being valued a certain way, and then ultimately have it not happen. And because then it gives you an opportunity to go fix those things and come back even stronger. And if you're another common misconception about private equity, I know we probably got to go soon, is that people think they want to buy like bad businesses.
Right.
They want to buy really good companies that have
a fair price.
A fair price that still have an opportunity to grow.
Yeah.
So like if your company's doing well and you're doing better 2 years from now than you were today, they're probably going to pay you more. They're going to be pretty happy about it too. They're going to be like, "Oh, it's great."
It's really true. Joe, this has really been a great conversation. I appreciate you sharing, what it's like coming from working for the like I said, the better private equity groups. I would say this, for anybody listening, if you ever get a call from DealGen that means you've cleared probably several hurdles to get that phone call. So maybe think about not missing out on that opportunity. Joe Zanca, your contact information's in the show notes, but for somebody listening, what's the best way to reach you?
Yeah, I think email joe@DealGenPartners.com or on LinkedIn. I try to stay pretty active on LinkedIn and post a decent amount and try to share insights and stories about, some of the stuff that I'm experiencing in this world of M&A every day.
Joe, you're a good man for sharing your insights. Thank you and appreciate you spending time.
Awesome, Todd. Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to the Second Bite podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes.